I started to think about suffering and well-being and what does that really look like, and one of the things that I know from my own work and my own research is that the truth is most people, not just in the United States, but in the world, don't live at the side of thriving, which is positive 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Most people live somewhere between around a 2 and a negative 2, meaning they're not suffering, but they're not necessarily thriving either. They're just kind of hovering in the middle. And this is what David Thoreau would have called, most men live lives of quiet desperation, this idea of quiet desperation. It doesn't mean that we don't have moments of happiness, because we certainly can and do. But what it traditionally means is that kind of hovering in this very delicate area where if enough stresses show up, we can slide into this side of suffering relatively easily, meaning that it's a little bit of a fragile state from a psychological perspective. Now, this isn't 100% of the population by any stretch, but it really is somewhere in the neighborhood of around 60% that people live somewhere between positive 2 and around a negative 7, 8, 6, 7, 8. And if you look at that far left side of the number scale, negative 10, this is what we would call clinical levels of anxiety and depression. This is often the point at which people maybe seek out help from somebody like me. Maybe they'll go on medication, but usually they have to be around a negative 7, 8, 9, 10 in order to be able to do that. And one of the things that I started to really think about when I was looking at my own issue with chronic illness, and I started to think about other people's process as well, is, well, what if most of us, including myself, are living somewhere between a negative 2 and a positive 2, and then you get hit with a chronic disease, and you have sort of the ongoing stressors of that, plus some of the acute things, if you have these acute flare-ups, where does that leave people on the scale? If everybody isn't clinically depressed, well, where are they? And most people find themselves sliding to the left of that scale, meaning just getting to a positive 2 on some days takes every ounce of energy that you have, and that it doesn't take much at all to find yourself in these subclinical levels of anxiety and depression, meaning not intense enough that you're being referred for psychotherapy or medication, but enough that it's significantly compromising the quality of your life. And in the case, let's say, of an ICD, an implanted cardioverting defibrillator, we know what the relationship is between reduced quality of life and having this life-saving device, because it can create a lot of anxiety for people. So if you have somebody who's ordinarily super optimistic and has these very high levels of optimism, and they're at a positive 8, 9, or 10, and then they're experiencing chronic disease, maybe they're going to shift somewhere to a positive 4, 3, or 2, right, on the positive side. But what about the rest of us? I mean, I certainly wouldn't call myself some kind of a super optimist. I didn't arrive in this world with this incredibly high level of well-being. I would say I fall pretty much in the average, somewhere between the positive 2 and the negative 2, at least prior to this research and the work that I started to do, which meant that it didn't take much for me to move into that suffering level. As soon as I started to get worried about my kids, as soon as I started to have extra PVCs, which in my case, I have all the time, somewhere between 2,000 and 20,000 a day, and how that can impact our sense of vitality and our sense of well-being. And so one of the gaps that I saw in the healthcare system was that when people are diagnosed with chronic disease, we know that that has a negative impact on quality of life. But what we don't do is give people the skills and tools to be able to improve or increase that well-being until they end up in these clinical levels or pathological levels of suffering. So you have to present with a considerable amount of anxiety or depression, what would be considered a diagnosable level, typically before you even get referred for help. So the idea that you have to break before we offer you some kind of support seems very backwards to me. This is a very interventive kind of model of medicine, but it certainly doesn't do anything to address the fact that we already know that if you have a chronic disease, you're going to have a higher than average propensity for moving into that level of languishing and suffering. And if we already know that, how come we're not addressing this at the point at which people are diagnosed, or long before they end up in a clinical state of depression? And so that's the work that I decided I wanted to invest my life in.